Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Sarah Rosen Wartell, and I have the great privilege of being the president of the Urban Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you to a conversation today. We'll be joined by New Jersey Senator Cory Booker, acclaimed economist Darrick Hamilton, and my fabulous Urban Institute colleague, Kilolo Kijakazi. And congratulations to them, because this is the highest number of registrants we've had for an online event at Urban since the COVID events started. So clearly topic on top of mind for us all. This is part of a series of discussions we're holding with changemakers and policy analysts on emerging questions from the crisis and our country's long overdue reckoning with ongoing structural racism. Quick housekeeping: the event's recorded. The recording and relevant links will be posted online after the event. Participants are muted. Please do share your comments and thoughts. We've already seen some of them. It's really helpful to us. We'll try to weave it into the conversation. And even if we can't now, it's great for us to know what you're thinking. We're going to talk today about the racial wealth gap, the result of choices we as a society have made that created it, and the policies that might close it. It's widely documented, but for example, Urban's own research shows that at the median, white families have 10 times more wealth than African-American families and 8 times more than Latino families. And although the gap has fluctuated over the past 5 decades, the gap is as high or higher today than it was in 1963, before the passage of the Civil Rights or Voting Rights Acts. And home ownership, one of the central ways to build family asset wealth, is at about 28 percentage points lower for Black Americans than for white families, and lower today than it was before the passage of the Fair Housing Act of 1968. And we live in an increasingly volatile economy where economic downturns, sudden disasters, and now pandemics rock families and communities, and some are hit harder and recover better than others. Our research by my colleagues just as recently as June showed how these forces frequently enlarge racial homeownership and wealth gaps, and we're at risk of that consequence, worsening outcomes once again. But that's a choice. This gap developed as a result of many different intentional and often intentionally racist policies implemented since slavery that have systematically deprived Black Americans of the wealth and capital that set families up for economic security. And it's a result of the choices we make each day to allow those conditions to persist. But shocks are also opportunities, because as we plan for recovery and rebuilding, as Michelle Norris recently said to Michelle Obama's podcast, we should not aim to return to normal, but instead rebuild our society more equitably. So we're going to talk today about tools that can help close the racial wealth gap, tools like baby bonds, which are not really bonds, but trust accounts set up by the federal government when a child is born. And I'm really pleased to start this conversation with Senator Cory Booker, who I hope will magically appear on our screen. The senator first introduced a baby bond, and it worked, a baby bond proposal in 2018 and featured it during his presidential campaign, and recently reintroduced the bill with a companion in the House sponsored by Congresswoman Ayanna Pressley. So Senator, we're going to talk in a few minutes with Darrick Hamilton, who initially wrote a version of this concept with Sandy Darity, and he and Kilolo can get into the facts and figures and mechanics. So I want to start with what inspired you, and to try to understand your thinking about why you think baby bonds is the right first step to close the racial wealth gap.
Well, first of all, I won't say it's the first step. It's a step that needs to be a part of a larger focus on these issues. And you said it in your really wonderful introductory remarks. I'm grateful for you. I'm grateful for the Urban Institute and this forum. But we have made conscious decisions throughout our history that have created this wealth gap and have done things to compound it, actually, the disparities in wealth in our country through our public policy. Overtly, through our tax code, every single year, we take over $600 billion, between $600 and $700 billion, through what we call in Senate parlance, tax expenditures. In other words, giving breaks to wealthier people to further compound wealth. And some of them are well known. It's the mortgage interest deduction, which is overwhelmingly used by the top 10% of earners in our country. But there are other tax expenditures that total upwards of $600 to $700 billion. But we don't do much in our tax code to help the creation of wealth. We know that wealth shapes every aspect of American life. Our very ideals of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness are connected to the wealth of families. Wealth is connected to educational outcomes and opportunity. Wealth is connected to healthcare and healthcare outcomes. So we know it touches all over, even whether you live around a toxic site or not, or live around clean air and have clean water to drink. And so this is such an urgent thing in America, where so many Americans, upwards of 40%, are living paycheck to paycheck. Paychecks help you get by, wealth helps you get ahead. And so this idea really was with this understanding. Now, we know that, as you said earlier, that this has profound racial dynamics to it. And we've gotten to the point now where we're creating more and more pathways for wealthy people to compound their wealth, that we now have a reality in America where just the Forbes 400 wealthiest individuals have more wealth than all Black Americans in the United States combined. So this is an idea that is one step, and it's a good step, because the outcome after 18 years really does collapse a lot of the racial wealth gap and help us to lead towards the creation of wealth. Those baby bonds, or as you rightfully said, interest-bearing accounts, can be used to buy a home, go to school, do the things that create wealth in our society. And the final kicker is it has a multiplier effect. When you create more wealth in America, it tends to grow and spread more equally and create more opportunity for us all.
So, Senator, you chose to frame this, probably for lots of reasons, as a universal program. But you've made your argument here for it in particular as its power to help to close a gap. Can you talk a little bit about your thinking about how we try to move forward against a racist history and build public support for programs that can do that?
So, I don't know if you noticed we're in an election year this year. I'm sure you've seen nothing about that. And I went around the country last year telling people that this election is not a referendum on one guy in one office. It's a referendum on who we are and who we are to each other. And we should have it as our goal to create a more beloved society. And patriotism is love of country. You can't love your country unless you love your fellow countrymen and women. And somehow we have built up this culture reflected in a lot of our legislative priorities that seems to think that virtues, which are not virtues, frankly, but ideas of selfishness, take care of my own, us against them, this idea that greed is good, as I used to hear during the 1980s. It is a perversion, even of what Adam Smith talked about in his moral sentiments and his writings about the moral responsibilities. We are a moral nation, founded in those ideals, far away from that history, far away from that ideals. And so when you ask me a question about that, the first part, I think, if we're going to love each other in this country, we've got to know each other and know ourselves. And we haven't even fully confronted our history in this country. We just don't know. We don't know about massacres in this country, from Colfax to Greenwood, where Black individuals and communities who are garnering power and influence were systematically throughout our country attacked and destroyed. How our policies that ushered millions of Americans into the middle class, from the land grants that went to immigrants coming into our country, denied to Blacks, to the GI Bill, to Social Security, all written to exclude, in ways to exclude African Americans, to even my family's history. Moving to New Jersey in the late 1960s, the redlining and the real estate steering. My parents ended up having a group of activists have to pose as them, literally a white couple posing as my parents, in order to buy the house in 1969 that we grew up in. That I grew up in. And so there's so much history there that has created these profound differences in America, where wealth is so accrued along such savage disparities along racial lines. And just in access to capital in our country. A recent study, I think coming out of MIT, shows that if African Americans had the same access to capital as entrepreneurs as white Americans did, we'd have about $1 to $1.5 trillion more dollars in our economy. And so this is not just an urgent issue for African Americans or minorities, it's an urgent issue for our whole country if we're going to be globally competitive. Because right now, the greatest natural resource any nation has is the genius of its children. And it's a global knowledge-based economy. But we're this nation that has relegated such a large percentage of population to having less opportunity for education, health outcomes, wealth, and more. And so a lot of my legislation that I've been able to partner with others on and even get past, from opportunity zones all the way to criminal justice reform, is trying to go right at these disparities in a way that could draw more and more people in to how I started my answer, which is just this ideal that we're all in this together, that we need each other, that we have to be invested in each other. And so this is something I hope that the baby bonds legislation is not just something that is I can build a coalition around, frankly, because it's based on ideas that have come from both sides of the aisle, and so benefited by Professor Hamilton, who you had on, who is one of the sort of genius innovators in this space. But I also think it's a way that we can begin, hopefully, to get people to understand us, America, better, and to be more committed to the unfinished business of racial reconciliation and racial justice in this country.
So I want to ask, they're reminding me that you have an event in a few minutes. So I want to ask you one more quick question. Ties two of these aspects together. There are other ideas, including a bill that you put forward to think about conversations about reparations in this country. And yet this is a unique moment in our country, not because we're having an awakening. I hate that word, since many people didn't have the luxury of sleeping through racist violence for many centuries, but we are having a reckoning with race in America. Do you see the dynamics around this proposal changing? Can you talk a little bit about is there momentum? Are you having new people opening the conversation with you? Do you think there's a realistic chance that next year legislation like the baby bonds proposal could move?
Look, I'm sitting in the central ward of Newark, New Jersey. The census tract I'm sitting in, according to 2010 numbers, the median income is $14,000 per household. And I moved here back in the 90s, and I always tell people that I got my BA from Stanford, but my PhD on the streets of Newark, learning from incredible people who don't mistake wealth with worth, as I say, but more importantly, understood what hope and hopefulness really is. You just talked about the luxury of having to be woke on these issues. I come from a neighborhood where people like Miss Yancey, Miss Wright, Miss Virginia Jones, who held this community I'm in together through grit and guts, who understood what hope really is. And so, yeah, I see lots of great signs, but I was taught by, Miss Virginia Jones' son was murdered in the lobby of the projects I eventually moved into, where she taught me that hope is the active conviction that despair will not have the last word. Hope is not a plan. Hope is struggle and sacrifice. Hope is putting yourself out there for the possibility of change, even if your hope gets slashed. Hope is something you have to resurrect in every generation after disappointment, after tragedy. And so, yeah, I have hope in the way that Ms. Jones did, and that I'm going to do everything I can to be an agent of hope and to make things happen. I can't rest on polling that says that Black Lives Matter is more accepted in the majority of our nation now, or that the top 5 books on the New York Times bestseller are ones that speak to people's moral yearning to better understand racial injustice in our country. We all have to take a responsibility, not to sit back in hope, but to take calloused and worn hope from working to make that change. And that's the only way it's going to happen. And I'll end with this, because I know my staff is going to kick me off, or you will.
We'll leave you on, but they'll get mad at me.
I want to just end by telling you this, that story of moving in, like the real housing segregation in New Jersey is one of the more segregated states in the nation because of this history that we've had, and because of efforts to keep low-income housing or overt efforts to keep Black people out of certain neighborhoods. But when I got to the Senate, I don't know if you do this, but a lot of senators have a high sense of self-regard. We tend to write books, and so when I went to write my book, I went back to find the people who helped my family move into the town in 1969 that were part of that ruse, that sting operation, that white couples would volunteer to follow my parents around when they were shopping for houses. And I found the lawyer that organized the whole thing. And I called him up. He was a retired New Jersey judge. He was 84. He's now since passed away, Arthur Lessman. And I just had to say to him, why would you get so involved with Black families trying to integrate your neighborhood at the time of fears of white flights, fears of of real estate prices going down, the same fears that literally Donald Trump tweeted in the last 24 hours accusing me of leading this effort to bring poor people into the suburbs. And he just said to me, I know the moment I made the decision, it was March 7th, 1965. He had just started his business. He was a young man trying to support his family. He's watching TV. Most of America was watching a movie called Judgment at Nuremberg. And that movie gets interrupted because this white guy on a couch suddenly sees a bridge in Alabama called the Edmund Pettus Bridge. And he is so shaken watching these marchers get beaten, one of them was John Lewis, that he said, I gotta do something. At first he wanted to go down to Alabama, but then he realized he couldn't afford a ticket. He was struggling to make his business work. So he said just 1 hour a week he was gonna spend trying to make a difference, trying to be hope activated. And he said, we designed these sting operations. 4 years later, I get a case file of this family, frustrated, struggling to move into New Jersey. We helped that family get into a home. And he goes, Cory, the name on that case file was your parents, Carrie and Carolyn Booker. And so it's not enough to sit back on your couch and watch on your TV all the protests, all the work, all the efforts. All of us, like Arthur Lessman, in this moral moment, like in his moral moment, have to get up and be a part of the hope, be a part of the struggle, be a part of the effort. Because there's one thing I know with the George Floyd Policing Act that Kamala and I were the Senate authors of, is that bill wouldn't have been possible just 6 months ago, but for the activism and the engagement, the Rainbow Coalition that took to the streets in this country and began demanding change. So that's what is hope to me, and I hope we'll continue that work and struggle.
Well, you've given us hope, and it's been a great launch to this conversation, and we look forward to having you back, hopefully sometime back in person, but in the meantime on Zoom, to keep talking about these issues. Senator, thanks for your work. Thanks for being with us, and good luck ahead. Stay well.
Take care now. Bye-bye.
And so now I'm going to be joined by Darrick Hamilton and Kilolo Kijakazi, also by the magic of technology, and it worked. I wish I could let the whole audience into the conversation between the senator and Darrick about hairstyles, but we'll do that another day. And really pleased to have both of you here. I think everyone knows, but really quick introductions. Darrick's the incoming professor of economics and urban policy at the New School, and Kilolo is my colleague and an Urban Institute fellow. She conducts research on economic security, structural racism, and the racial wealth gap, has been doing this work on wealth and assets in the African American and minority community for decades. So Kilolo, I'm going to start with you. We just heard Senator Booker talk about his approach to closing the gap, but let's take a step back. Just talk about what the racial wealth gap means in practice, and why is it so important to families to have wealth, and what harm does the lack of wealth do to the opportunities and just emotional welfare of Black families?
Thank you. I'm going to just start with the definition to make sure that we're all on the same page. And wealth or net worth is what you own minus what you owe, very simply. And the racial wealth gap is the difference in that net worth between white families and Black families and other families of color. And having an insufficient amount of wealth has meant that Black families have been pinned to the economic bottom of this society and unable to be able to purchase their own homes in many cases, to obtain high quality education without having to go into backbreaking debt, to experience economic security, to weather crises like the pandemic. And most importantly to Black families, I think, is not being able to pass on wealth to their children. And so to put it succinctly, in a nation where net worth too often is used to define one's value, the racial wealth gap means that Black people are not valued as highly as white people. And when you're not valued, you are susceptible to all kinds of inequities including employment discrimination, education discrimination, housing discrimination, discrimination in financial institutions, and discrimination in policing. But it's not, just as Senator Booker said, it's not just Black families that are affected by the racial wealth gap and its impact. The racial wealth gap leaves all of our society worse off because we don't benefit from all that Black families and other families of color have to offer.
Thank you. That was a powerful way of describing this. I've not heard it that way before. Darrick, I want to just spend a moment on the pandemic before we talk about the policy here, because as I mentioned in the opening, shocks of various kinds tend to make things worse for everybody, but some people do even worse and some people struggle more to recover. So what do we know so far about how the pandemic could be affecting the wealth gap, and how do we think about the response? Well, we'll come back to how do we think about the response and our policy agenda in this moment.
Yeah, first off, thank you for doing this. Thank you for hosting this and all the work that you do with your leadership, Sarah. I sincerely mean that. And thanks for Senator Booker for championing this. And of course, thank Kilolo for, as you pointed out, her decades of work in this effort. It should be shouted out. Building economic security over a lifetime is the impetus for a lot of this work on the racial wealth gap that we see on the national stage today. So to answer the question, we know from previous recessions that inequality grows and the racial wealth gap grows in the aftermath of a recession. Sadly, there are entities that benefit from recessions in their aftermath. Asset prices get lower. People lose their homes because they don't have enough resources to maintain them, and they lose their businesses. I mean, right now we know there are reports, Pedro da Costa, he reported in a Forbes article that about half of Black businesses have gone down in this pandemic. So, it presents the opportunity for bottom feeders to come in and buy assets at low prices. And when we have the upswing, benefit from them. But let me say wholeheartedly that, as you described in the opening, this despair and inequality is a choice, that there can be a public response to prevent this type of vulnerability. There's legislation right now being debated on the Hill to prop up businesses to deal with this vulnerability of not having activity because we made a moral decision to hibernate our economy so that people don't risk their lives in transaction.
So now I want to turn to the solutions. And since Darrick, you were part of the first sort of writing up of the current iteration, the current thinking around the baby bond proposal a few years ago, can you talk a little bit about why you landed on this particular structure of, and maybe even just describe the concept in the beginning and the way it works, and then why you think that mechanism is one you think we all ought to be thinking about seriously?
Yeah, to build on Kilolo's answer, the source of inequality is capital itself. Let me make that point. And then the other point to build on is that we think about wealth as an outcome, but its true value is functional. Its true value is the economic security it provides, the ability to have agency in your life. If you're confronted with a job loss because of a pandemic, wealth can allow you to secure yourself economically over that period. I mean, we can keep going. If you're confronted with an expensive legal system, wealth provides you opportunity to get beyond that. If you're confronted with a health ailment, wealth provides you the ability to not go bankrupt in dealing with some emergency condition. The real value of wealth is what it can provide for you in terms of agency. That's one big point. And then the other big point is that if we think about Black-white inequality, here are two common myths that people don't really know, don't have in their mind, but the empirical evidence doesn't support. First, when we control for family resources, Black families acquire as much education as white families. That should be known. If anything, they acquire more. Controlling for family income, Black kids get as much education as white families. Another myth is once you control for income, there is no savings disparity in terms of active savings between Black and white families. A lot of people believe that the wealth gap is the result of some individual deficit, some not saving amongst people. But the reality is that most Americans, unless you're wealthy, don't engage in that much active savings. The ways in which Americans are able to generate wealth is passively. Being in an asset that passively appreciates over your lifetime. Being a homeowner as opposed to a renter. And what's the difference between a homeowner and a renter? A down payment. Being a business owner as opposed to a worker could have all the best ideas in the world, but if they have no capital to bring those ideas into fruition, they are a worker, and they have to sell those ideas or work within an infrastructure where a capitalist who's an entrepreneur who has capital can benefit from it. So if the source of inequality is capital itself, that was the basic idea of baby bonds. And it was built on child savings accounts where, we saw that we can develop accounts for children. But for me, the biggest component of those accounts was the endowment itself, not the savings, but rather the endowment. So this is saying, whether you're a capitalist, a socialist, forget about those jargon terms. It's saying that inequality gets locked in if you don't have capital in the first place. So this is saying everybody as a birthright should have access to capital when they're a young adult so that they have an opportunity to benefit from asset security over their lifetime.
And can you just spend 1 minute, since we haven't actually talked about either the senator's bill or your proposal, the mechanics by which that birthright gets established?
That's right. So at birth, you would be seated in an account, and there are two versions, and we'll talk about the senator's version. And if we want, we can talk about the other version, but I think the relevant one is the senator's version at this point. So the accounts are seated at birth to everyone, and that forges a stakeholder society, similar to Social Security. It says independent of the race of your family, your gender, or your family circumstance, you get seated in an account that makes you independent when you become an adult from your parents to some extent. Then the accounts are gradually resourced depending on your family's economic circumstance so that they're progressively funded. In other words, if you're from the most wealth poor or income poor family, you get the largest size of endowment. And if you're from the poorest family, you get less of an endowment. And then these accounts grow over time in a federally managed account so that, again, independent of decisions your parents make, good or bad, you have some resources reserved for when you become a young adult. And then when you turn 18, and I got to adhere to your 1 minute, I'm sorry, I'm rambling on, I'll get real quick. When you become 18, the accounts will be restricted towards either investments in an education so that you can have access to a managerial job and benefit from a pension and all the other benefits that go along with that without debt from education. Seed capital to start a business, or some seed capital for a down payment for a home.
All right, great. So there are a couple of things I want to come back and unpack, and so we're going to go to speed answers here. So first, Darrick briefly mentioned that we have experience with savings accounts that were designed to demonstrate the propensity and capacity to save under different circumstances. Can you quickly sort of tell us what we learned from experience with IDAs and child savings accounts?
Sure. So with those accounts, we learned that people low wealth, low income can and do save and invest in assets when they have the same kind of structure in place that upper income households have. What we also learned was that it is extremely difficult for people with low income to save. And so these accounts that are initially seeded with, when we were doing the tests of them, $1,000, but states are now starting these accounts with as little as $25. Families are not able to make up the difference through saving. Furthermore, we just talked about the fact that the wealth gap was not created as a result of a lack of saving on the part of low wealth people or people of color. It was a result of structural racism. So Darrick's approach uses a large endowment to compensate for those structural barriers by providing an endowment that will reach for low wealth families or low income families up to as much as $50,000 to $60,000 when the child becomes a young adult.
And just quickly, because I'm not sure everyone has actually seen the bill, can you say what, at least in Senator Booker's version, is the large endowment and the amount of the incremental payment? I don't either want to, go ahead, Kilolo.
For Booker's bill, every newborn would receive $1,000 at birth in this endowment. And then each year after that, depending on the economic circumstances of the family, they could get up to $2,000 a year until they are 18.
So you mentioned economic circumstances of the family, and the senator talked about this as well. But one of our challenges is that we aren't particularly good at measuring the economic circumstances of families in terms of wealth. We have, at least we don't have a track record of doing it. We do it a little bit better. Well, maybe I'll let you, Darrick, why don't you talk a little bit about the pros and cons of this? Because this is, the senator's bill makes a choice, and their choice is to say that after your initial birthright, the incremental investment each year until you're 18 is dependent upon your family's income, not dependent upon your family's wealth. And talk to me about why the benefits of wealth versus income there and the challenges of accomplishing that.
Yeah. So let me start with the fact that if you were to look at the wealth distribution of Blacks and the wealth distribution of whites, there's very little overlap. So if you use wealth as a means test, it becomes very powerful in redressing racial inequality because there's very little overlap. So that's one key point. And also the fact that we're trying to redress wealth, I mean, that makes the policy in the framing of Ibram Kendi anti-racist, because by design and implementation, it's, although universal, intended to use markers that are very racially disparate. But to answer your question more directly,
you answered my next question, so thanks, you got there.
I'll use your words that you started out with in the beginning, which is, it's a choice that we don't identify wealth as much in this country, but we do in certain, you've also made this point previously as well. If we want to deny poor people some resources, we can identify some bank account holdings they may have and use that. We've used that against them in years past. But the reality is that for any account over $1,000, the IRS is very good at knowing what's in that account. And for those people that are able to hide their wealth overseas through various approaches, and those people would have enough wealth to begin with that we could identify, that they probably would not benefit beyond the $1,000 seed in the beginning. So I guess my larger point is that although we don't capture wealth in this country, I think in this modern age, this electronic age of electronic finance, I don't think it would be so difficult or a stretch for us to identify wealth. Indeed, part of the Booker bill includes a proposal that the United States government invest better in identifying wealth. In a nutshell, wealth is probably a more paramount indicator of one's economic circumstance than income. Income is useful for taxes on a periodic basis, but if we really want to know American circumstances, wealth is important to identify and really disaggregated by ancestral origin as well to know about the plurality of wealth holding in America based on ancestry.
One of the things I'm excited about that my colleagues here are working on, including Kilolo, is starting to think about how we use innovative data science techniques, both to disaggregate data that we do have, but maybe that we don't have with the kind of granularity about geography and race that we might want to have, but also to try to think about what kinds of measures and proxies we can use as well, or scraping and other techniques. So I think this topic of how do we measure wealth, not just for us annual surveys, survey and a Fed statistics, but actually to try to use that as one of the ways rather than just income for policy is an area that's very fruitful for conversation going forward. So I want to ask, before we have to sort of come to a close, each of you to think about, this is a little bit of a challenge to you, to think about and I'm going to start with Kilolo to model how to do this. Darrick's going to try to turn this in, so the question is, what's the biggest criticism of the baby bond proposal? And almost everybody, Darrick, I can't wait to see how you try to turn the criticism into an opportunity and an advantage. But I want you to try to wrestle with the pros and cons of different approaches. And then last thing I'm going to get to, because we're running short of time, so I want to put this on the table as well and invite you both to think about this. As we are recovering from the pandemic, we are going to invest in many forms of, I'm sorry, my phone, many forms of recovery kinds of efforts. And there are ways in which and we will do that as a nation because we're going to need to come back from probably a very severe economic consequence. There are ways to do that, as you described earlier, may be universal, but have the effect of dealing with those who have been left out of recoveries in the past. And so I'd like to ask you to also even as you talk about the baby bond proposal and its pros and cons, I'm also interested in asking you to think a little bit about how do we bring the analytic approach that you've each described so well here, that is behind baby bonds, into thinking about the economic recovery. So 2 questions. Kilolo, I'll let you go first.
So in terms of criticisms of the baby bonds approach, one is that predatory practices could be targeted to these young adults who are just receiving these endowments. And so there are several things. One, the endowments can only be invested in the areas that Darrick mentioned: education, home ownership, business. But there is also the need for strengthening of consumer protection regulations and laws. As this legislation is enacted, hopefully there will be the accompanying protections that go with it. Now, with respect to investments, in addition to these endowments, there needs to be policies that address the barriers that are facing us now. So we need to think, as we come out of this pandemic, we need to think about the proposal of a federal job guarantee so that everyone who wants a job will have one, whether their former job got eliminated or not. We also need to think in terms of our education systems. And again, as we come out of this pandemic, every child should be able to attend a school where they're getting a high quality education. And in order to do that, we need to rethink the financing of our K through 12 school systems and think less about leaning on property taxes and more in terms of investment of federal funds, so that the child who needs the most gets the most. I'll stop.
All right. Darrick, same 2 questions to you.
Yeah, so, you're right. We're going to hopefully we spend a whole lot more to address this pandemic. And it would be a lost opportunity if we don't use that spending to make us more resilient to the next pandemic, the next public health crisis, the next climate crisis, or the next economic downturn in general. So I think we need to think about how do we do that. So not just stopgap. Stopgap is necessary, but not sufficient. The next thing is to make us more resilient. And there are two people that I think a good framing would be useful, and it is indeed the framing of baby bonds. We know from Ira Katznelson in his book, When Affirmative Action Was White, that it was by design and implementation that Black people were largely excluded from the New Deal and post-war policies that generated a white asset-based middle class. And that's key, that they were universal policies, but they were racist by design and implementation. And we all know that Social Security in the 1930s excluded domestic and agricultural workers, for example, and 90% of Black women were in that category and over half of Black men. That was a design issue. In implementation, there was little federal oversight of the programs and in a context of a racist Jim Crow society. That's an implementation issue. So Ibrahim Kendi gives us a new model in how to be an anti-racist, his book, that first off, recognizing that nothing in America is race neutral. Let's come to grips with that. We have structures that we've built that are racist, and pumping money into those existing structures may lead to unintended consequences of exacerbating inequality. So by design and implementation, even if you're gonna have universal policies, you need to make sure that they're anti-racist. You need to make sure that there's equity in the way. And you know, I'm being vague and I can be specific, but in the interest of time, baby bonds is intended to be by design and implementation anti-racist. And we can think of other policies as well. To answer your question of critique, Kilolo hit the biggest one, so I won't repeat her answer. But the other critique is, well, what about something else? So, you know, I talk about baby bonds and then some people say, what about early childhood? And I'm like, yeah, that's important. We should invest in early childhood. My concern is that a lot of big, bold, progressive ideas get pitted against one another, that we end up in this zero-sum framework. And frankly, the liberation from this is, I get a chance for a shout out, my colleague Stephanie Kelton's book, The Deficit Myth. She presents a notion of why indeed we have perpetuated this deficit. And by the way, only one side of the aisle actually pays attention to pay-go, and that's the Democrat side. Republicans pay attention to it, not when they want to pass their legislation like that $2 trillion tax cut for the wealthy, but as a constraint on the Democratic Party. So I think when we come to grips with the idea that any investment in our greatest resource, the American people, needs not be framed as deficit spending, but rather investments in a future that is promoting shared prosperity.
Well, on that note, and as a C3, putting aside any political or partisan perspective that may be offered on your personal capacity, Darrick.
I'm a professor, I can be partisan.
You can do it. I want to just say something, first of all, to the audience, which is that many of you have sent really terrific questions to us, and we've touched just the tip of them, and we will make sure that both of the panelists get all of them. And it shows to me, though, something really important, which is there is a lot of interest in the details here. There's a lot of thinking about this approach. There's a lot of thinking about complementary policies. There's a lot of thinking going on about wealth inequality, and the richness of this debate and questions really and comments in the commentary suggest that this is a topic to which we'll return. I thank you all for being here for this. Special thanks to Kilolo and Darrick, and of course to Senator Booker for joining us. And last, just final shout out, this series, Evidence to Action, there's been a lot of talk in this conversation and in the questions about the power of homeownership and how the pandemic in particular may affect housing policy and its effect on wealth disparities. Stay tuned, watch this space for additional events that will be taking on that topic directly. Thanks everyone for being with us, and please be well and be safe.